I would like to welcome you, and we will to begin by the pre-opening lecture of this and I would like to introduce Dr. Whiteford Margo, Doctor and President of IF International Federation of Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus, and she will try to give us an idea about the international role of this very important organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking the organisers for giving me the invitation to speak to you tonight. I know that I speak very quickly, so please tell me to slow down if those that are not native English speakers can't follow me. I wasn't sure how much this audience would know about Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus, so I thought I would start with an overview of the subject and then tell you a bit about my involvement with Spina Bifida and then about the work of the International Federation, also known as IF or IF. So first of all, what is Spina Bifida? Well, it's a failure of closure of the neural tube during very early embryonic development. The failure of the closure can happen at any point along the length of the neural tube, and usually when this process happens normally, the closure is complete within the 6 weeks of pregnancy, so very early when an embryo is just about the size of a coffee bean. As I said, any part of the tube can be involved, and this gives rise to different types of neural tube defects, which are given different names depending on the region of the cord that they occur at. The first type of neural tube defect is anencephaly, and this is a very severe type of neural tube defect where the whole of the upper part of the skull and brain fails to form. And as you can imagine, this is not compatible with survival. Most of these pregnancies are lost as miscarriages, and those that do survive to term die very shortly after birth. The next type of neural tube defect is a thing called an encephalocele, where the bony defect occurs in the skull, either at the front or the back, and it can be just the membrane surrounding the brain that herniate, as we call it, through the bony defect, or there can be brain tissue, in which case it can, of course, lead to learning disabilities. And the babies who have what we call posterior encephaloceles at the back of the head are often blind, because this is the part of the brain that's important for vision. Meningoceles are, again, can occur at any point along the spine and the skull, but in this case it's just the membranes surrounding the spinal cord or the brain that move out through the bone, and these babies tend not to have any kind of neurological problems. And it's the next type, which we often refer to as just spina bifida, which is really called a myelomeningocele or a meningomyelocele. And with this type of defect, the spinal cord protrudes through the bony defect, and that leads to neurological deficits. It's a bit like having a spinal injury before you're born, the same as you would have in a car accident when the spinal cord is damaged. I've included Spina Bifida Occulta. With Spina Bifida Occulta, it's just the bony part of the spine that fails to come together during development, and about 1 in 10 people in the general population have this type of Spina Bifida, and it doesn't usually cause any problems. It's only when 2 or more of the bony parts of the spine are involved that it actually causes problems. Nowadays, most pregnancies where a baby is affected by Spina Bifida are detected during pregnancy. And this can happen in 2 ways. In many countries, ladies are offered a blood test around 15 to 16 weeks of pregnancy, looking at a chemical called alpha-fetoprotein. And when the baby has what we call an open spina bifida, where the membranes are exposed, then this chemical is increased. And for those where it might be a closed lesion, where there's skin over the defect, then they can be often diagnosed by an ultrasound scan, which many people are offered around 18 to 20 weeks of pregnancy in most countries. So what is the kind of scale of spina bifida? It's estimated that between 300 to 400,000 babies are born every year with spina bifida worldwide. Throughout Europe, 4,500 pregnancies are affected, but many of these pregnancies are terminated, and I'll come back to that a bit later, so that the live birth rate is a bit lower. And as you can see in America, about 2,500 babies are actually born with spina bifida every year. There are particularly high rates in Guatemala, and it's suspected that it's a fungus that grows on their maize crop, and this interferes with folic acid metabolism in the body, giving high risks of spina bifida. And in northern China, again, there are particularly high rates of babies being born with spina bifida, again, estimated about 100,000 every year. It's not actually known what causes this, but it's suspected that their high levels of industrial pollution may be contributing in China. So looking at Europe, as I said, about 1 in 1,000 pregnancies will be affected by spina bifida. We've seen a natural decline over the years. This graph shows the figures for England and Wales, and as you can see, that there were particularly high rates in the early 80s, and that these gradually declined, and since the early 90s the level has stayed much about the same. Throughout Europe, it varies from country to country, obviously, depending on kind of religious beliefs, but in a lot of European countries, between 75 to 90% of pregnancies where spina bifida is detected are terminated during the pregnancy. There's a geographic variation in the occurrence of spina bifida. In my part of the world, I'm from Scotland, so people of Celtic origin who live in Scotland, Wales and Ireland have much higher occurrences of spina bifida than our neighbours who live in England. And even within Scotland, there's a variation between the west coast and the east coast, with higher figures in the west coast than there are in the east coast. It's been recognised for a long time that spina bifida occurs more commonly in areas of deprivation, social deprivation, and in countries with high rates of poverty. So, do we know what causes spina bifida? Well, from a geneticist's point of view, which I am, we call it multifactorial, in that we know that some babies will be born with a genetic susceptibility developing spina bifida, and other babies will be exposed to environmental factors that can cause spina bifida, but it's only the group in the middle where they've got the genetic susceptibility and exposed to the non-genetic factors that spina bifida actually occurs. We're starting to learn more about the non-genetic factors that can be involved in causing spina bifida. As I said earlier, it's been recognised for a long time that poor nutrition increases the risk of having a baby with spina bifida, but in recent years we've found that the opposite problem, that women who are particularly obese also have an increased chance of having a baby affected by this condition. Maternal illnesses such as diabetes mellitus increase your risk, and ladies who have epilepsy and have to take anti-epileptic medication which interferes with folic acid also increases the risk. So, why do we know that genetic factors are involved? Well, if we look at these 1,000 ladies, like I said, we would expect one of them to have a baby or a pregnancy that was affected by spina bifida. But once that lady has had one baby with spina bifida, then her chance of having a second increases dramatically to 1 in 25. And if she has a second affected child, it increases further to 1 chance in 10, which is significantly higher than that 1 in 1,000 risk of the general population. So, what are these genetic factors? Well, unfortunately, at the present time, we still don't know what they are, but there are research departments throughout the world who are working on this constantly to try and lead to us understanding better what causes these genetic susceptibilities. I mentioned folic acid earlier, and as I said, we've recognised that poor nutrition can lead to increased risks of spina bifida. And as we need folic acid for new cells being produced, and when an embryo is developing in the womb, you need lots of new cells being produced, it was wondered if folic acid might be one of the culprits. So back in the early 90s, the Medical Research Council carried out a multi-centre trial, and they looked at ladies who'd already had one pregnancy affected by spina bifida, who therefore had this 1 in 25 risk of having a second child. And they divided the ladies into 4 different groups. The first group were given folic acid tablets. The second group were given folic acid tablets with a multivitamin tablet. The third group were just given the multivitamin tablet without the folic acid. And the fourth group weren't given either the multivitamin or the folic acid. And as you might expect, in the 2 groups that didn't get folic acid, of 100 ladies, 4 of them went on to have a second child affected by spina bifida. But in the 2 groups that were given folic acid, only 1 lady out of 100 had a second child with spina bifida, and we therefore realised that folic acid could prevent what we call a recurrence of spina bifida. A second group in Hungary, led by a man called Seisel, then looked at what we would call first occurrences of spina bifida, and they gave whole populations of people folic acid and realised that this also reduced the risk of having your first child affected by spina bifida. So since that time, it has been recommended that ladies planning a pregnancy should take 0.4 milligrams of folic acid each day, and for ladies who have already had a child affected by spina bifida, they take it at a higher dose of 4 milligrams. But the most important thing here is that it has to be taken well in advance of becoming pregnant. The recommendation is 2 to 3 months prior to becoming pregnant. And folic acid, after it's taken into the body, is involved in all these kind of biochemical pathways, and it is thought that genetic variations in the enzymes that are involved in these pathways are probably part of the genetic susceptibility to spina bifida. So now looking at what spina bifida involves for those that are affected by it, we know that around 80 to 90% of children born with spina bifida will have the related problem, hydrocephalus, where there's a build-up of the fluid inside the ventricles, fluid-filled spaces inside the brain, and this can lead to intracranial pressure and brain damage if it is left untreated. But these days we can now insert shunts which drain the fluid either into the peritoneal cavity in the abdomen or sometimes into the heart, and this can stop that brain damage occurring. Unfortunately, these shunts quite often block or become infected, so it means that the child has to have repeated surgeries throughout their life, and it's well recognised now that each time a child has such surgery, their IQ declines, leading to learning disability. Almost all people born with spina bifida will have some degree of motor deficit and some difficulty in walking, and about half of those will be permanent wheelchair users. Again, over the years, the equipment available for people with mobility difficulties has improved, although in certain parts of the world there is still difficulty in getting access to such aids. Along with the mobility problems go sensory problems where people have lack of sensation to their skin, and unfortunately this can lead to the development of pressure sores. In children who sit in wheelchairs all the time, it often happens in their buttocks or in the sacral area, and these can be extremely difficult to try and heal up. It means prolonged periods of time in hospital, lying on their front, and obviously missing time from school or in adults' time off work. For those that are mobile, they don't realise that their footwear are rubbing on their feet and therefore develop sores on their feet and toes. And again, this puts them off their feet and they spend long times unable to either attend school or work. Perhaps the biggest problem for people affected by spina bifida is impairment of sphincter control, leading to double incontinence, and also in some people a risk of developing renal failure. Again, in developed countries in the world, the facilities available for managing incontinence have improved immensely, allowing people to be socially acceptable and not wet or smelling badly when they go to work or school. Many children with spina bifida develop a curvature of their spine, meaning they have to wear uncomfortable braces, such as the one on the left of the picture, or some even have to undergo surgery to insert steel rods into their spine to keep them straight. Again, this can result in repeated surgeries throughout childhood, but nowadays the rods are able to grow with the children and often means they just need to have one episode of surgery. The children who develop hydrocephalus, as I said, can have learning disabilities, and this may require special assistance at school or the need to attend schools for children with special needs. The learning disabilities particularly affects their organisational skills. So for adults with spina bifida and hydrocephalus, it's difficult for them to manage getting up in the morning, getting themselves clean and dressed and out to work. And as you can imagine, this interferes with their ability to be successfully employed. The children quite often sound more intelligent than they actually are, and that their verbal communication skills are pretty good. Arnold-Chiari malformations are an associated problem where there is a herniation of the brain downwards. Often this can be asymptomatic, but increasingly we're finding more and more adults are developing problems in adulthood with their upper limb movement and problems with swallowing. Untethered cord, that's the same sort of thing at the other end. Initially the children do well following their surgery, but because the cord is tethered, as they grow, there is tension put on it, and those that were able to walk find that they are having to use wheelchairs, and those that were previously continent start to have bladder and bowel control problems. And this, of course, all these medical problems have an impact on family life. A disability doesn't just affect a child, it affects a whole family. For the parents, first of all, there's the anxiety when the baby's first born as to whether he or she will survive, and each time they have an admission to hospital, what is it going to mean for them? They also worry about their education. What sort of school are they going to go to? Will they be bullied by other children if they manage to go to a mainstream school? And some parents, of course, worry about the chance of having a second child with the problem. It's not an easy life for siblings of a child with spina bifida either, because, as I say, a disabled child is a disabled family, and quite often the parents' time is taken up with the child who's got the disability and they feel left out. And family outings are no longer the same. They have to, if the child has a mobility problems, they can't do the same things that they used to. And again, this can cause problems with the siblings accepting their disabled sibling. There's a financial burden on parents of disabled children. Often, if two parents are in employment, one of them has to give up their work to care for the child with the disability. And their house may not be suitable for a child that's got mobility problems, meaning they have to spend money on adapting the house or even moving to a different area to find suitable housing. And of course, mobility will be a problem if you've got a child with a wheelchair. In many countries, even the developed countries, public transport is still not terribly accessible for people using wheelchairs. A new problem that's starting to arise: in the past, the children with spina bifida often didn't survive into adulthood, but there's an increasing number of 40s, 50s and 60-year-olds now with spina bifida, and this has created a whole new set of problems. In my own association in Scotland, we now have more adults with spina bifida than children, because many of the pregnancies are terminated and therefore there are not so many children being born, but those that are surviving are going well into adulthood. And adults with spina bifida have all the same medical problems as people without spina bifida aging, but it causes more of a problem to those if they've already got a mobility problem. Many adults with spina bifida have mental health problems, particularly depression, because they feel isolated if they're not able to get out to work. And if they've got incontinence problems, it can make it difficult to form relationships. I was shocked a number of years ago to read a paper published by Australian researchers who had looked at the cause of death in adults with spina bifida. And the first, most common, as you might have thought, would be shunt-related problems for their hydrocephalus. Second was renal failure, but the third was actually suicide, which is very depressing. The mobility problems obviously continue on into adulthood. I've already mentioned they have difficulties finding useful employment, and if you can't work, then obviously you've got financial worries. Another problem which we hadn't kind of recognised earlier was obviously if adults are living to their 50s and 60s, that means their parents are in their 70s and 80s, and often they were the main carer for the adult with the disability, and this is creating problems in many countries, which we've been fighting to try and get aid for these people that are affected. My own involvement, as you can see, I was born with spina bifida, but I was one of the lucky ones, and I didn't develop hydrocephalus. I had a fairly normal childhood. I did all the usual things, and I went to the same mainstream school as my unaffected brother. I went on to university and I studied for a degree in pharmacology and then medicine. I learned to drive a car. I took part in the London Marathon. I became a paediatrician and then a clinical geneticist. So it was only in 1981 when the Scottish Spina Bifida Association invited me on one of their holidays to Vancouver that I first met other people with spina bifida and realised that not everybody was as lucky as I was and was not getting on leading normal lives. So I was then invited to join the Scottish Spina Bifida Association, and they've not let me away 34 years later, and I've been their chairperson for the last 15 years. The International Federation for Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus, or IF as we call it, is an umbrella group, and their members are the Spina Bifida associations and organisations throughout the world. To become a board member of the International Federation, you either need to be the parent of a child with spina bifida or hydrocephalus, or be an adult who's affected by the conditions. Alternatively, you can be someone who's involved with a spina bifida association, or you can be a health professional that works with people with spina bifida, and you have to be nominated by one of the members of the International Federation. Well, it was recognised that I ticked several of these boxes, and therefore in 2010 I was invited to join the board of the International Federation, and I had a very quick promotion to vice president and became their president in 2013. IF was the idea of this gentleman that some of you may know called Bjorn Rundstrom, who was from Sweden, and he had a daughter with spina bifida and was heavily involved in the Swedish Spina Bifida Association. He thought that it would be useful for associations from different countries to get together and exchange ideas, and therefore back in 1979 he invited 20 other European countries to join them at their national conference in Stockholm. Everybody else thought it was a great idea, so 2 years later at the Irish Association's national conference, the International Federation of Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus was formally founded. And Bjorn remained their president until 1995, when another father of a daughter with spina bifida took over. And again, some of you might know Pierre, who is from Belgium, and he brought the International Federation on and increased its membership to over 40 during his reign, and included countries from out with Europe, as far afield as Australia and South America. And here you see all three presidents of the International Federation when I became president in 2013. We have a truly international board at the moment. Our board is made up of these people from all these different countries. Most of them are parents of adults with either spina bifida or hydrocephalus, but Jackie from England is the chief executive of the UK Spina Bifida Association, and Santosh from India is a paediatric urologist in India. The staff numbers of the International Federation have also grown over the years, and we now have 6 staff members based in our headquarters in Brussels and a few others dotted around the world. This is our mission statement, and that is to improve the quality of life for people with spina bifida and hydrocephalus throughout the world, and also to decrease the prevalence of both these conditions by primary prevention. When I joined the board, we worked within 4 main domains. These were prevention, human rights, international solidarity, and knowledge transfer. We do the knowledge transfer by networking with these other disability groups and through our workshops and conferences which we organise. These conferences can be very useful. This is 2 girls who met at a conference which we held in Guatemala a number of years ago, and because of the poverty in that country, again, people with spina bifida had never had the opportunity to get together and meet each other. But despite the poverty, like all young people, they're into social media, and therefore they've been able to keep up the contact through emails and Facebook. The mobility problems for people in Guatemala are much greater than those that I face in the UK, and this is a kind of typical road in a city in Guatemala. I suspect that there may be streets in Athens that have similar problems. China was one of our most difficult countries to get involved because changes in healthcare in China are dictated from above. But Pierre and I were eventually invited to join the China Disabled Persons Federation at one of their conferences, and after the presentations we made, the Chinese government have now recognised spina bifida and hydrocephalus as one of the conditions that they will provide care for. And we're hoping that China will be able to join our membership at our international conference in Milan later this year. From the international solidarity point of view, we have projects throughout developing countries, mainly in Africa, and through work with volunteer neurosurgeons, we've been able to provide care for children affected by both spina bifida and hydrocephalus to prevent this type of situation arising. We've also provided the families in Africa with what we call our SHIP passport, which is the Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus Interdisciplinary Programme. We were finding that although the children did reasonably well after they'd had their surgery in the hospital, when they went back to their villages and towns, they weren't getting the health care which they required. So the families are given these passports which tells the people in the local villages what type of health care is required. We also have programs where we provide shunts for their hydrocephalus surgery, and we send out nursing and medical staff to train local people in things such as intermittent catheterization, which keeps their kidneys healthy and prevents the incontinence in the children. So these are the African countries where we have projects at the moment, and say we've also got some work going on in China and South America. The funding for these projects comes from a variety of sources. Some of the governments of European countries provide money for developing countries, and we also have money donated by a charity called If Child Help in Belgium, and from some pharmaceutical companies. From the human rights point of view, we spend a lot of time lobbying in the European Parliament to get the rights of people with disabilities, particularly those affected by spina bifida, recognised. And this was one such paper we presented in the European Parliament in Strasbourg. They allowed us to have an exhibition of photographs which we had asked our members to send in, showing the positive aspects of spina bifida, and this was the photograph from Switzerland that won the competition in that year. Recently we have developed a global community known as PUSH, which is People United for Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus, and this is getting the word spread wider as to the needs of people with these conditions. We have a website where the individual members, or even you don't need to be a member, to get your campaign advertised on this website and get further support for changes that you're wanting to make within your country. From the prevention point of view, we obviously are lobbying for folic acid supplementation, or in many countries fortification. And we had in 2010 a campaign at the European Parliament to make sure that ladies were getting the message that the folic acid had to be taken prior to pregnancy, and then we had a follow-up meeting the following year again in the European Parliament in Brussels. So what's the difference between supplementation and fortification? Well, supplementation with folic acid tablets means that it's aimed at our target group, women who might become pregnant. The disadvantages are that the women need to know when to take it, and it requires them to make the effort to take the tablets. And obviously it doesn't cover pregnancies that are not planned, and certainly in the UK it is estimated that just under 50% of pregnancies are unplanned. Folic acid fortification of a mainstay foodstuff, on the other hand, means that there's no need for any of these changes in behaviour, and it covers unplanned pregnancies. But the disadvantage is that some people see this as mass medication, that you're giving folic acid to a whole population for, in fact, a very small group within that population that's going to benefit. And in the past, there's also been concerns that too much folic acid could have harmful effects. This is now all been disproven, but it is very difficult to get that message out to governments and get them to change their plans. We work very closely with the Food Fortification Initiative, and this is their map from 2013, which shows the countries which are fortifying a foodstuff. You will see that there is a distinct lack of fortification throughout Europe. The UK is shaded in because we fortify our flour with iron, but not with folic acid at the present time. We have moved from these 4 domains in the past year to looking at 6 priorities, and these are listed here within the International Federation. And in order that we can carry this work out, we have developed a global expert network led by a global expert panel, and I have shown them here. Ben Worth is a neurosurgeon based at the Children's Hospital in Boston. Dan Morrissey is a lawyer who actually has spina bifida himself. He's based in Washington. Amy McPherson is a psychologist who's based in Toronto, Richard Fennell, a geneticist in Austin, Texas, Anne Malloy is a biochemist in Dublin, in Ireland, and Klaus Kramer is based in Germany and is very involved in nutrition, so we've got him leading public health. And I think I'll leave things there, but I'm happy to try and answer any questions that you might have about the International Federation.